history is not made by great men. My name is Chris Carlson. Welcome to Shaping San Francisco, where history is not an insult, but something we make together. Shaping San Francisco is a rebuke to our amnesiac culture. This program presents excerpts from an ongoing series of public talks held at Counterpulse, a home to art, culture, and politics at 9th and Mission in San Francisco. You can learn more about the lost history of San Francisco at shapingsf.org and check out upcoming events and our ongoing series of talks at counterpulse.org. So I'm just going to start the night with a venerable San Francisco writer, Mark Twain, actually. People don't always associate him with San Francisco, but he was a big part of the early history here. And what people really don't know about Mark Twain, rarely know, is that in his last decade of life, he made his major focus of activity being a member of the Anti-Imperialist League of the United States. And this little clip that I'm going to read you here is from a thing called A Letter to a Person Sitting in the Dark. And just to sort of set the stage, it's Mark Twain is rather long-winded, and so this is 5 minutes to read this to you. And it's an excerpt of a rather longer piece. And he's going along giving this explanation to somebody sitting in the dark, basically somebody outside of civilization, and why they should be enthused about being taken over by civilization. And he sets up the stage with showing how all the European powers had been colonizing different parts of the world and imposing really brutal regimes. And he thinks of America as something different than that, and he's horrified to find out that America is pulling the European plan on the Philippines. So here's an excerpt from this piece. Our case is simple. On the 1st of May, Dewey, Admiral Dewey, destroyed the Spanish fleet. This left the archipelago in the hands of its proper and rightful owners, the Filipino nation. Their army numbered 30,000 men, and they were competent to whip out or starve out the little Spanish garrison. Then the people could set up a government of their own devising. Our traditions required that Dewey should now set up his warning sign and go away, warning other powers to stay out of the Philippines. But the master of the game happened to think of another plan, the European plan. He acted upon it. This was to send out an army, ostensibly to help the native patriots put the finishing touch upon their long and plucky struggle for independence, but really to take their land away from them and keep it. That is, in the interest of progress and civilization. The plan developed stage by stage and quite satisfactorily. We entered into a military alliance with the trusting Filipinos, and they hemmed in Manila on the land side. And by their valuable help, the place, with its garrison of 8,000 or 10,000 Spaniards, was captured, a thing which we could not have accomplished unaided at that time. We got their help by ingenuity. We knew they were fighting for their independence and that they had been at it for 2 years. We knew they supposed that we were also fighting in their worthy cause, just as we had helped the Cubans fight for Cuban independence. And we allowed them to go on thinking so, until Manila was ours and we could get along without them. Then we showed our hand. Of course, they were surprised. That was natural. Surprised and disappointed. Disappointed and grieved. To them, it looked un-American, uncharacteristic, foreign to our established traditions. And this was natural, too, for we were only playing the American game in public. In private, it was the European. It was neatly done, very neatly, and it bewildered them. They could not understand it, for we had been so friendly, so affectionate even, with those simple-minded patriots. We, our own selves, had brought back out of exile their leader, their hero, their hope, their Washington, Aguinaldo, brought him in a warship in high honor under the sacred shelter and hospitality of the flag, brought him back and restored him to his people and got their moving and eloquent gratitude for it. Yes, we had been so friendly to them and it had heartened them up in so many ways. We had lent them guns and ammunition, advised with them, exchanged pleasant courtesies with them, placed our sick and wounded in their kindly care, entrusted our Spanish prisoners to their humane and honest hands, fought shoulder to shoulder with them against the common enemy, our own phrase, praised their courage, praised their gallantry, praised their mercifulness, praised their fine and honorable conduct, borrowed their trenches, borrowed strong positions which they had previously captured from the Spaniard, petted them, lied to them, officially proclaiming that our land and naval forces came to give them their freedom and displace the bad Spanish government, fooled them, used them until we needed them no longer, then derided the sucked orange and threw it away. We kept the positions which we had beguiled them of. By and by we moved a force forward and overlapped Patriot ground, a clever thought, for we needed trouble, and this would produce it. A Filipino soldier crossing the ground where no one had a right to forbid him was shot by our sentry. The badgered patriots resented this with arms, without waiting to know whether Aguinaldo, who was absent, would approve or not. Aguinaldo did not approve, but that availed nothing. What we wanted, in the interest of progress and civilization, was the archipelago, unencumbered by patriots struggling for independence. And war was what we needed. Sound familiar? We clinched our opportunity at this point in our frank statement of fact to the person sitting in the darkness. We should throw in a little trade taffy about the blessings of civilization for a change and for the refreshment of his spirit, then go on with our tale. We and the patriots, having captured Manila, Spain's ownership of the archipelago and her sovereignty over it were at an end, obliterated, annihilated, not a rag or shred of either remaining behind. It was then that we conceived the divinely humorous idea of buying both of these specters from Spain. It is quite safe to confess this to the person sitting in darkness, since neither he nor any other sane person will believe it. In buying those ghosts for 20 millions, we also contracted to take care of the friars and their accumulations. I think we also agreed to propagate leprosy and smallpox, but as to this, there is doubt. But it is not important. Persons afflicted with the friars did not mind other diseases. With our treaty ratified, Manila subdued, and our ghosts secured, we had no further use for Aguinaldo and the owners of the archipelago. We forced a war, and we have been hunting America's guest and ally through the woods and swamps ever since. And then later, Twain writes an incredible apology for General Funston, who Funston later, he's the guy who captures Aguinaldo through complete crude subterfuge and fraud. And after being saved by Aguinaldo, he actually turns on him and captures him. Later, Funston comes here and runs the military during the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. And we are blessed or cursed with his name on one of our streets. And it's a really bloody history. And there's a long defense, satirical defense of General Funston that you can find at shapingsf.org. That's in the Filipino section. So that's the end of that part of it. And now we're going to bring up Abe Ignacio, and he'll take it from there. He's the author of The Forbidden Book. And if you haven't seen the book, get one tonight. It's an awesome, amazing book, and it's a really rare treat to be able to get your hands on it with the author in the house.
I want to take you all back over 100 years ago and examine the links between San Francisco and the Philippines, war and economic growth, media and empire. If one were working and living in San Francisco in 1899, the city would be booming and bustling with military-related activity. The Spanish-American and later Philippine-American wars brought prosperity to San Francisco's capitalists. Leading local families like the Scotts and the Hearsts profited greatly from the country's imperial thrust overseas. The Scots Union Iron Works built warships that sunk the moribund Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, while war sold newspapers, and William Randolph Hearst's newspaper circulation grew and grew and grew. Media mogul Hearst built his powerful and far-reaching empire on the horrors of the Spanish-American and Philippine-American wars. His newspapers blared out an incessant and loud drumbeat of imperial conquest. San Francisco was the major embarkation city for the troops sent to fight in the Philippines. It was the Philippine-American War that intertwined San Francisco and the Philippines together in dramatic fashion. To the victor goes the privilege of writing history, the glorification of its conquests, and the silencing of the conquered. Forgetting was officially sanctioned so that a war that was at least 50 times more costly in human lives than the Spanish-American War could be relegated in American textbooks as only an insurgency. It is time to give those who have been long silenced a voice in writing history. What was the Philippine-American War? Filipinos began the Revolution of Independence from Spain in 1896. 2 years later, the revolution got a boost when Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898, at the start of the Spanish-American War. While U.S. forces watched in Manila Bay, Filipino soldiers quickly defeated demoralized Spanish troops, and in a matter of weeks, much of the country was liberated from Spain and under Filipino control. General Emilio Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence on June 12, 1898, and the process of nation building began. By September, a constitutional convention drafted a Philippine constitution, creating a Congress, executive, and judicial branches of government. By January 1899, the Constitution was ratified, the President was elected, schools nationwide were reopened, and ambassadors were sent to various countries, including the United States, to seek recognition for the new republic, the first in Southeast Asia. The Philippine Republic was officially inaugurated on January 23, 1899. However, unbeknownst to most Filipinos, the Spanish, who had lost control of the Philippines to the Filipinos, had signed a treaty in December 1898, handing over the Philippines to the United States in exchange for $20 million. As early as May 1898, pro-war leaders such as Senator Albert Beveridge argued that the Philippines would create a new market for American goods. With our protective tariff wall around the Philippine Islands, its 10 million inhabitants, as they advance in civilization, would have to buy our goods. But more importantly, the Philippines was a stepping stone to the even larger China market. On the other hand, opponents of annexation, such as George Frisbee Hoare, argued that taking possession of the Philippines represented a shift from being a republic to an empire. Many historians believe the Treaty of Annexation was destined for defeat in the U.S. Senate. Now we know that the U.S. had a secret, prearranged plan to provoke a war. Soldiers were posted at a contested bridge, and as soon as Filipinos crossed the bridge, Private Willie Grayson and his men fired, provoking the desired Filipino retaliation and allowing the U.S. military to launch a massive attack. All this took place 2 days before the scheduled vote in the U.S. Senate. False messages were sent that the Filipinos had begun an unprovoked attack against America. The news deceived the Senate enough to change votes so that the treaty to annex the Philippines passed by one vote. The war was started based on a lie. The war fever that started the Spanish-American War carried over to the Philippine-American War, which began on February 4, 1899, less than 2 weeks after the Philippine Republic was inaugurated. Filipinos resisted this attack on their newfound independence. The U.S. was forced to deploy 127,000 U.S. troops during the first few years of the war, during which over 4,200 Americans were killed. In order to justify an increasingly bloody war, McKinley conveniently portrayed Filipinos as uncivilized savages needing to be educated, civilized, and Christianized. Senator Beveridge explained it thus: "The Filipinos are a barbarous race. They are not capable of self-government. How could they be? They are Orientals. The Declaration of Independence applies only to people capable of self-government." What most people did not know was that Filipinos had already declared their independence and had begun the process of building the first democratic republic in Southeast Asia. Moreover, Filipinos had an educational system far older than that of the United States, with the country's premier European-style university predating the oldest American university. Public education dated back to the 1800s, when one public school was established in every town and an education was compulsory for all children. And Filipinos did not need Christianizing, since the majority were Catholic and had been for centuries. The degrading and racist stereotypes of Native Americans, blacks, and Chinese as buffoons, ignorant, childlike, or less than human were reapplied to Filipinos. Rampant racism fueled the brutality that characterized the Philippine-American War. This is reflected in a letter by a soldier who wrote, "Orders were received to burn the town and kill every native in sight, which was done to a finish. About 1,000 men, women, and children were killed. I am probably growing hard-hearted, for I am in my glory when I can sight my gun on some dark skin and pull the trigger." Depending on which historian you prefer, the estimates of Filipinos killed during the war range from 250,000 to 616,000 to over 1 million. The Philippine-American War took place during a historical period when racial violence in the U.S. was both at its height and was officially sanctioned. Although slavery had ended, the hopes for racial justice and equality under post-Civil War Reconstruction were dashed as African Americans were increasingly disenfranchised. 6 segregated regiments of African American soldiers were sent to fight in the Philippine-American War. While some felt that by demonstrating their loyalty they could improve the lot of African Americans back home, others grew increasingly critical of the war. Sergeant John Galloway of the 24th Colored Infantry wrote, "The future of the Filipino, I fear, is that of the Negro in the South." During the war, Filipinos were not the only ones depicted derisively. Leading the opposition to the war was the U.S. Anti-Imperialist League. Reflecting the sexist and racist attitudes of the time, the anti-imperialists were depicted as old, foolish women enamored of the Filipino leader Aguinaldo. A leading opponent of the war, Massachusetts Senator George Frisbee Hoar was portrayed as a black man in what was intended as an insult. People might find some striking parallels between the Philippine-American War and events of today. The Philippine-American War was based on false, fabricated information. The country then was deeply divided on the war as daily reports of Filipino attacks on American troops inflated the casualty figures and the public could see no end. Filipinos were demonized. The patriotism of the opponents of the war were questioned. Public opposition grew as Senate hearings, news reports, and court-martials revealed that prisoners had been tortured and killed. The presidential election of 1900 was between the incumbent President William McKinley, who prosecuted the war, and the Democratic challenger William Jennings Bryan, who opposed the war. Theodore Roosevelt, who seated McKinley, declared the end of the war on July 4, 1902. In fact, the war in Mindanao, southern Philippines, had just begun, and it took 12 more years after Roosevelt declared his mission accomplished before armed conflict finally ended. And finally, to quote from Reverend Martin Luther King in his famed 1967 Beyond Vietnam address to the clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam, which sadly has much currency in today's America. Now it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must read Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abe. That's awesome. And I think the Philippine War really sets the stage for one of these obvious truths, which is that the city itself has been radically shaped by our military adventures throughout the Pacific Rim. And not only is it in terms of the physical landscape of the city and really amazing parts of the city being dedicated to war and plunder, but also the population that lives here. People come here from places that get conquered by the U.S. military, and I think that's what Oscar Penaranda is going to speak to next, which is the remarkable and vibrant Filipino community that came to live in San Francisco and expand throughout the California region. Oscar Penaranda helped found the San Francisco chapter of the Filipino-American National Historical Society as its first president. He also belongs to the Filipino-American Educators Association of California. He advocates for the teaching and creation of Filipino heritage studies and Filipino language in all his educational efforts.
Yeah, this year, 2006, they're celebrating the centennial. Folks are celebrating the Philippine centennial. 100 years, the first great wave of Filipinos started coming here to the United States. I know it's a big hullabaloo, the centennial and all this stuff. I'm part of it also. But it's good to know that that centennial wouldn't happen if the Philippine-American War didn't happen. What drove that centennial, what drove the Filipinos from the Philippines to come here was the fact that a few years before, they were fighting a desperate war against really two world powers. That is Spain, a dying world power, and the United States, a rising world power. And the Filipino people had to wage war against both of them without really any arms to speak of or any money to fund them. But they did it, and they fought for many, many years. I wanted to sort of remind people that right after the war, 1906 was also a San Francisco big event, as you know, the big earthquake. When they were rebuilding San Francisco, it was coincidental with right at the end or the ending of the war, the Philippine-American War, or what the record shows that that's the end of the struggle. But actually, the Filipinos struggled for their independence till 1930, in the 1930s. Actually, the end of the U.S.-Philippines War is still in contention. Some people say it ended when Aguinaldo, the president and the leader at the time, was captured through a ruse. That was 1901 in March. Some people say it ended there, but the Filipinos kept fighting for their independence. Some people say it ended in 1902, right before Teddy Roosevelt proclaimed it a pacified place, when they captured the last of Aguinaldo's men, when the commander of that island, Leyte and Samar, was captured or surrendered in June 18th of 1902. In fact, the guy was only 25 years old. That was his birthday when he surrendered. And when he surrendered down to the town in Leyte, in Baybay, Leyte, southern tip of Leyte, the Americans, General March, traditionally wanted them to, lay down their arms, and they'll be walking in the plaza and the streets in chains. But the commander refused to do so because in his mind they were not criminals. They were patriots who was fighting for their country's independence. And when he surrendered only on one condition, that none of his men and women would be put in chains and that they would march down the street. Although they had surrendered, they would surrender peacefully, they'd lay down their arms, but they were not to be branded as bandits, as most of the people, the leader of the revolutionaries, were called by the Americans at that time. I know this personally because that man was the father of my father. Another one of the hidden stuff. He's hardly in any history books unless you look at the records in the archives, as I found him accidentally. My own father did not tell me this because my own father was educated by the Americans at the time. He was born in 1904. So when he was growing up, he was already propagandized. I left the Philippines when I was 12. I came back 20 years later. I started hearing about these things. I also told about Chris about the stories about this Philippine-American War. There are hardly any textbooks in the Philippines and here, but the stories abound. If you go to different places, if you go to Mindanao, they'll tell you this is the place where they shot at Budbadao, where they massacred everybody. All the people have stories. And a lot of what Chris wanted me to talk about, a lot of the influence of that U.S.-Philippines War is also not recorded. For example, one is the role of women in that war. Actually, it's hardly mentioned in any history, the role of women, right? In any history of any war. But in this war, and in any other war, the role of women was very important. They did, besides fighting side by side with the men and with the other men, they delivered important documents, they hid it, they staged parties as a cover for our secret meetings of the revolutionaries. They nursed the wounded and cared for the sick. They did many things. And I know this not from the books, but from the stories that I've heard. And also from what I see from my own life, because the women, Filipino women, they always play a large role. I don't know how some white folks think that Filipino or Asian women are demure. I don't know where they got that idea, because I never met one. They're very strong, powerful, and they have their own minds, and historically so. Before the Spanish came, it was like that. And so in the Philippine-American War, they took a big part. The second thing that I wanted to say is that the practitioner of martial arts, the practitioner of the Filipino martial arts, were the descendants, were the direct descendants of the Philippine-American War. The people who taught the 1st and 2nd Infantry, if you see films of the Second World War Filipinos born and raised here, who went to fight for in the Second World War in the Pacific Theater, the 1st and 2nd Infantry, they're all being trained the way the martial artists of the Filipinos were trained. So you give that person a blade, he'll know what to do with it. You notice that if you see some films, there's always being trained the bayonet as a blade and the blade as the arm. But anyways, that martial arts tradition from the Philippines went to Hawaii, and from Hawaii came here to California in the 20s. They worked in the fields, and in the cane fields, and in the farmlands here in California. They practiced their arts secretly. Some became quite popular, but not as popular as the Chinese or the martial arts. You know? But now it's getting its day in the sun, I guess. The third thing I wanted to point out about the Philippine-American War are the streets here in San Francisco. Every street here has a pretty good story. And I know that Funston, that's a street, that's the one that captured Aguinaldo. And there's also a street, Lawton, Lawton Street here. I love the ironies of life, because this General Lawton, when he was chasing down Geronimo, who was captured and escaped several times, the final time he was captured, Captain Lawton was part of the engineer that captured him. He was volunteered or sent to the Philippine-American War a few years later, and he had a contingent of an army there, and he was the first general killed in the Philippine-American War, the first U.S. general killed, Lawton, because he was killed by a guy named Geronimo too, Licerio Geronimo. So you know what comes around goes around, I guess. But we should have a Geronimo Street right across Lawton there someplace. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
The other thing that I wanted to point out is the Colt 45. The Colt 45 was designed and manufactured because the Muslim Filipinos were resisting in such fierceness that after you shoot one, they keep coming. In other words, you need the 38 revolver would not knock them down, so they keep coming, and they had dynamite in their belt. It was a big ritual for a Muslim Filipino at the time to say a prayer near the hour of his death, of his sure death, and before he died, he was going to go to the army and kill as many enemies as possible until he gets killed. The Spanish call it juramentado. The Muslim has a different name, for it. And but this type, the U.S. Army the 38 couldn't bring him down. They keep coming. So even though if you shoot the guy, he's still going to be able to kill you, because he was going to come here and explode right in front of you, and everybody was going to die. So they invented that Colt 45, to physically knock the man down, and at least he would explode far away. And lastly, I wanted to point out is that the hatred of the Filipinos against the American was so intense. It was a wonder how within a decade, maybe after 1910, between 1910 and 1920, actually 1915 to 1930, the Filipinos loved the Americans within less than a decade. And I always wanted to know how that happened. Of course, propaganda, the media was all owned by the colonizer, so that my father and his generation were educated by Americans, so they had American brain. Myself, I left when I was 12, but many of my cousins know more about U.S. literature than I do. They read more about British literature than I do. They still do. So their curriculum there was all U.S. And I'm not going to tell too much about it, because MC is here, and MC is going to put more San Francisco history and U.S. Philippine-American War history together. So that's all. I'll answer some questions later.
Tune in next Thursday at 10:30 p.m. when activists and historians MC Canlas and Teresita Bautista join the conversation on the Philippine-American War. Shaping San Francisco is produced and hosted by Chris Carlson and sponsored by Counterpulse, the City Lights Foundation, Nature in the City, and Independent Arts and Media. Radio broadcast on KUSF is produced by Indie Arts, online at www.artsandmedia.net. Thanks for listening, and thanks for making history on Shaping San Francisco.